I'm pleased to introduce Kathleen Terner, a teacher, speaker, and author. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. Many people are fascinated by your adventurous lifestyle. Can you tell us about your background and what initially sparked your interest in motorcycle travel?
Thank you so much for asking. My story is a little bit unusual because if you had asked me 6.5 years ago, I would have said there was absolutely no way that I would ever be brave enough or strong enough or skilled enough to ride my own motorcycle. I never never dreamed of becoming like a cross country, cross continent motorcycle adventurer. But I think what kind of happened is that I rode on the back of a motorcycle on my second husband's motorcycle through all 48 United States. And I just really loved the feel of the wind in my face and the texture of the road and the rumble of the bike and just the sense of freedom and exhilaration from seeing just the beautiful country that we live in. And when that marriage started falling apart, I realized that if I was going to keep riding a bike, I'd have to get my own. But it was not an easy process for me. I've never really been a talented athlete. I like to joke about the fact in junior high, I was on the basketball team and didn't make a single basket in a game. I tried gymnastics and fell off the balance beam and couldn't breathe. And when I took my motorcycle skills test, I like to say that I failed spectacularly. So I rode on top of the cones and outside the line, and I couldn't brake in time. And then when I went back a week later to retake my test, I got the lowest possible passing score. Uh, and even 2 years after that, I couldn't ride up my own driveway. So, and that was just a few years ago. So, I've really experienced a real transformation in my life, and I love to be able to share with people how that came about.
I heard that everything is practice, 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 and it takes 10,000 hours to get really good at anything. So I think with your experience, that's probably what happened. Um,
Well, I would say it was more of a heart issue
uh-huh.
because really I find that a lot of the struggles I was experiencing in life were related to being afraid.
Hmm.
So, when I was too afraid to ride up my own driveway, at that same time, I was going through a second divorce and battling throat cancer. So I lost the ability to eat and speak, and the hair on the back of my head fell out. And I had to program a speech app to talk for me in my high school classroom. And I just was afraid of living alone, being alone. I was also just really fearful about the mistakes I'd make. I feel like I had a lot of shame over my failures in life, and I was just at a low point. I felt like my life could never be used for good again, that I would never be joyful and confident again. And so for me, it was more not so much practice, 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 but changing my perspective.
Yeah, so was your perspective that actually made
hmm
writing such a challenge.
I think it
Yeah.
made a lot of things a challenge. And, I think for a lot of us, while we may not, maybe not everyone listening has this like burning desire to ride a motorcycle, I think everyone can connect with the idea of having a dream or a wish or a desire for something we would like to do, but being too afraid to actually do it. So,
Yeah.
what happened, I think for me, one of my biggest fears was just traveling alone. And right after I finished my battle with throat cancer, my divorce was finalized, and I really was trying to figure out how I could take a cross country trip by myself and just didn't feel like I was able to do that. And I had this life changing conversation with a neighbor of mine because this was at the height of the pandemic. And I live in Oregon, and my son lived in Washington, D.C., and we hadn't been able to see each other for months because neither of us felt comfortable flying across the country. And I was talking to my neighbor about how, I missed my son so much, and I was so disappointed I couldn't go on a summer trip because nobody else wanted to travel at that time. And he said to me, Kathleen, I know exactly what you need to do. And he's this rather quiet, but abrupt individual. And so when he said that, I was like, "What? Tell me." And he said, "You need to ride your motorcycle across the country to see your son." And my first response was, "But how could I do that on my own?" And then, being as matter of fact as he was, he just said to me, "Well, you've got 3 months to figure that out." And it kind of gave me a pause, and my perspective changed in that moment. Instead of thinking about all the reasons I was too afraid to go by myself, I started thinking about, okay, if I wasn't so afraid to go by myself, what would I need to do to get there? And I realized, okay, I would need to, be comfortable riding my bike out of my driveway. I would have to get a rack for the back of the motorcycle to put luggage on. I'd have to buy luggage. I'd have to figure out a route. I'd need an app to make hotel reservations on. I'd need maybe someone to check in with every night. And what I found is, as I took one step after another in the right direction, that trip ended up becoming a reality. And the trip itself ended up being truly life changing.
That's really useful advice because we have a workshop that we offer sometimes where we encourage people to think of a big goal, but
Hmm.
then to think, what's the first step?
Right,
And what's the first step of the first step? So
right.
somehow naturally it came to you. And also, I think being a mom and wanting to see your son is a
Hmm.
great motivator.
Absolutely. When he said that, I think if it had been anything other than one of my children, I just think the conversation might have ended there. But it was kind of a two-pronged thing. It was really, like I said, not the practice, but the heart and the mind. So I had this motivation to see my son. I also, right after my second divorce, was in two different women's Bible studies. And it just so happened that in both of those Bible studies, I learned more about the Holy Spirit. And, I've been a Christian for decades at this point, and I know about, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. But I had never really kind of fleshed out what does it mean to have a Holy Spirit with us. And in these studies, I began to experience God's presence in a very real way in my life, to the point that I didn't feel alone. And I think that feeling that presence gave me the courage that I needed to be able to continue making those steps. But the funny thing was, the day that I left on my trip, I met a friend for lunch, and then from there I was going to head east, and we went to lunch. And this is another friend, not my neighbor, but also very matter of fact guy. We ate lunch and we walked out to our motorcycles, and I'm getting on my bike to leave on an 8-week solo trip after never spending a day on my own. And I thought he was going to give me some kind of pep talk, like, good luck, you've got this, or I have faith in you. And he just said something like, well, it's time to go. And then he left. And I looked at my bike and I'm like, what have I done? Because it's one thing in a Bible study to tell yourself, oh, God is always with you, but it's another thing to head out by yourself on a 700-pound machine when you're this rather small of stature person who's never traveled alone. And so my second thought, however, just immediately after that first thought was, wow, I get to ride my motorcycle every day for 8 weeks. So I was already learning how to reframe my situation in a more positive light. And then what happened is, as I left on that trip, it was really kind of amazing how every step along the way, God taught me another positive life lesson. So I've written two books about the transformation of my life. The first one is actually, I think I have a copy of it here. The first one is this two-wheeled wind therapy here. And this kind of like chronicles my first trip that summer and each of the positive life lessons I learned along the way. So I don't know if you want me to describe any of those or whatever, but I feel like the trip itself ended up being really transformational.
Uh, I was wondering what was there after your uh, Oregon to Washington, D.C. trip? Was there a specific moment or experience that made you think, I need to explore the world now on two wheels?
Well, I think it would help if I explained just a little bit about that first trip, because I would not have
Uh-huh.
had the courage to do that if I hadn't taken that first trip.
Uh-huh.
So on that first trip, essentially kind of the first few days, I realized that I was indeed okay with being by myself. I realized that even though I was on my own, I was not alone. Between just appreciating the beauty of the country around me, interacting with fellow travelers, being able to stay in touch with people via social media and so on, and then when I got to South Dakota, I decided to take on something called an Iron Butt Association ride. And I like to joke that that kind of sounds like a rather indelicate joke or something, but it's actually a highly respected international organization where you can get certified for riding long distances in short periods of time. So I had no clue whether I could do this. The longest I'd ever ridden a motorcycle in one day was 400 miles, and I was attempting to go 1,000 miles during that time. What happened is that just a few hundred miles in, I realized, oh my gosh, I'm having so much fun. Why don't I try to do even more? So I ended up going from Custer, South Dakota to Niagara Falls in a day and a half. So in 36, less than 36 hours. And I think what I discovered on that portion is that I was really a much stronger person than I had realized. And then seeing my son in Washington, D.C., just helped me to kind of focus on my blessings. After that, I did one of the most challenging roads in the country called the Tail of the Dragon. I don't know if anyone listening has heard of it, but it's a really famous road in the East where people from all over the world come to travel on it because it's got so many curves in a short period of time. And I had been there as a passenger on in the past, and I had seen that tree of shame they have where people can hang up their totaled motorcycle parts. And if you had told me at the time that I would come back on my own motorcycle, I would have probably, just killed over laughing. But I had no idea whether I could actually complete the course or not. But after doing it twice, I think I began to see myself as a biker in my own right instead of somebody else's riding partner. And then I went, back west towards the coast and going up through California to Oregon on my way home, I was able to see several friends that I had known for a long time and to talk with them about the challenges I had experienced in my life and some of the mistakes I had made. And I think the combination of the success that I had experienced on the trip, as well as these conversations, helped me to realize that, the past may have shaped who I was today, but it didn't have to define me. So, we've all had things happen to us that we wish maybe hadn't happened. But I began to be able to see that, it's truly up to us to decide what we want to do from today moving forward. So, coming back from that trip, I think I had more of a sense of strength. I had more confidence, more joy, more hope. I also was able to see myself in a more positive light as a person of value. And so I began to start asking myself when I experienced a challenging situation, instead of fixating on all the parts I was afraid about, I started to ask myself a very important question. And that is, what would I do if fear was not my first thought? And in fact, that's my shirt that I have on for you right here, right now. But to me, that's kind of like one of my guiding principles. What would my action step look like if fear wasn't my thought? So you asked me, like, how did I end up deciding to take these big adventures? What happened is I kept getting these dreams and ideas. Instead of turning them down because they were out of reach, I started asking myself, what would I do if I wasn't so afraid of that? And I took on bigger and bigger challenges. So, like the summer after that, I ended up going to all 48 states and competing a 2,000-mile IBA ride. And then the summer after that, when the border to Canada was open, I made a choice to go on one of the most dangerous roads in the world, up the Dalton Highway to the Arctic Ocean. And that trip was what truly um, changed me in such a way that I've now been able to travel to multiple continents.
A lot of people have seeing all 50 states as their life goal, I'll say.
Mm. I
And
haven't been on a
is that what
motorcycle
your
funny.
seeing the 48 states was, that you want to like get them all, get into
Well,
all
there
of
was
them?
kind of that aspect. On that second trip, I actually didn't set out with that plan. I just wanted to hit the states I hadn't hit the summer before. But then as
Hmm.
I'm traveling, I realized, well, I want to go to all my favorite states also. So why don't I just do all of them? But for me, you mentioned like my view expanding. I've gone from wanting to travel within Oregon to all 48 contiguous states to then including Alaska. And now it's more all six rideable continents. So I've been to four of the six continents at this point. And this summer I'm going to Australia. And next Christmas I'm going to South America.
Wow, those are going to
So
be
that's
so
more my goal.
beautiful, beautiful
Yeah.
things to
Yeah.
places
I'm
to
just
see.
truly excited about it.
So one man, when we were talking about your trip from Oregon to DC, uh, asked the obvious question, which I wouldn't even think of asking, why not take a car?
Well, you know, I hate to say this, but I think the person that asked the question has never ridden a motorcycle. Maybe I'm wrong, but the thing is, and that's it is a legitimate question because a lot of people would prefer to take a car. But the thing I love about being on a motorcycle is it allows you to fully live life in the moment. For someone who in the past struggled with being crippled by fear, if you think about it, when we have fearful feelings, we're usually worrying about something that's going to happen in the future, or maybe feeling shame or fear about something that happened in the past, but we're not like enjoying the moment. The wonderful thing about being on a motorcycle is that it really allows you to fully enjoy the moment because the way I like to put it is you experience your surrounding with all five of your senses. So, for example, if you're riding past the ocean, you can taste the salt on your in your mouth. You can smell, the rotten seaweed. You can feel the sun on the back. You can hear the waves. You can see the sun. And those of us that ride motorcycles sometimes refer to cars as cages because instead of being trapped in a cage, you are open and free to be able to experience the world around you fully. And I have to tell you, there are just so many times when I'm on a motorcycle, whether in this country or another country, and I just can't help but think thoughts of gratitude for the ability that to be able to experience so many different cultures and lifestyles and environments and landscapes with all five of my senses. So it really comes down to that idea of, fully living in that moment.
So it's a uniquely accessible, and also it's not as expensive as a car uh,
Well, that is so
to
true.
see the world, right?
I have a favorite taco stand that's 45 minutes from my home, but with the prices of gas, I don't really feel like driving my car, 45 miles to have a taco and come back. But on a motorcycle, you can turn it into an adventure and save gas money. So, yeah, that really is a very nice thing about riding a motorcycle is you can travel farther for less. Yeah.
And it saves gas. That's true. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And before these extensive journeys, did the adventure mean something different to you than it does now?
Yeah, I would say that my trip through Alaska to the Arctic Ocean redefined adventure for me. I don't think many of us living in the United States realize how well kept our roads are. Just for the most part, when we pull our car to the driveway and maybe get beyond our little neighborhood, most of the roads are made out of asphalt and they're usually fairly wide and they have a line down the middle and cars there's just one car on each side of the line, and there's rules that people follow about how to drive, but the thing is, I know when I made the decision to try to go up to the Arctic Ocean on the Dalton Highway, I think part of the reason I was able to make that decision is I didn't fully realize what I was getting into. Um, I posted on Facebook that I was going to go take this adventure, and within a very short time frame, I had dozens of people from all over the world telling me all the reasons why I couldn't do this. I was a woman, I was traveling alone. There weren't enough gas stations. There were too many bears. The roads were horrible. And in my new frame of mind, I did listen to what those people said very carefully. But my mind turned towards, well, what could I do to mitigate those problems? So I got extra gas cans, I got bear spray, I took a dirt bike training course to handle my bike better on dirt and gravel. I got a GPS tracking device so somebody could follow me. I rented a sat phone so I could communicate even if I was in a place without cell phone coverage. And I just decided that I would rather try to make it to the Arctic Ocean and fail than to not try at all because I might fail. I didn't find this out until after I left, but there are about 40 fatalities a year on that road, partially because it's this isolated road designed for semis that are going back and forth to the Arctic Ocean, and they have the right of way. There are no services, there's no one you can call for help. The roads are mostly dirt and gravel. I like to describe it as a hiking trail with semis on it. It's extraordinarily dangerous. I wrote goodbye letters to all three of my children, knowing that I might not make it. And I headed north, and I really quickly discovered that everything that everybody had said was true. And so, the funny thing is, I did make it to the Arctic Ocean with not too much trouble. I mean, it was challenging from a writing perspective and tiring, but I never felt like my life was truly in danger going north. But then what happened is, after I made it there, it's a 2-day drive on this gravel and dirt road. After I made it to the Arctic Ocean, I was talking to my older son on the phone. He said, Mom, I want you to check your tires. And, there's no tire replaces there. And I'm like, honey, why do that? I mean, there's nothing I can do about it. But he insisted. I went out to my motorcycle and I saw in the very short piece of tire that was still visible between the ground and the fender, this nail sticking out of my tire. And it took me until about 2 in the afternoon the next day to get that sorted out. And by that time, it had been raining all day, and the dirt and gravel road had turned to mud. And the bike that I was on was not designed for mud. Nobody wanted to loan me their bike or rent me their bike. I didn't own the proper type of bike for that kind of a road. I looked into renting one with an official organization, but because bikes so often get totaled on that road, they were going to charge me 1 or 2 thousand extra dollars just to cover replacing the bike if I got in a major crash. So I was riding a bike that wasn't designed for the road, and it was terrifying, absolutely terrifying, going south from the Arctic Ocean back towards Fairbanks. And that leg of the trip was what really kind of, as you said, like, what changed my idea of adventure. I think surviving that part of the trip is what has changed my life probably more than any other event in my life. So I think, experiencing something so treacherous and making it out on the other end. I'd love to tell you more if you're interested, but there's like a whole thing of what happened on that journey that just did truly change adventure for me.
Wow. Well, going back a little bit, uh, you said a very quotable quote, and I didn't retain it, but it was basically something like, the past happened
Hmm.
to me, but it doesn't define me.
Yes,
Something like
exactly.
that.
So, for us to say, well, the past doesn't affect me, wouldn't be real for most of us, right? Like,
Ye-
we have to understand that the past does shape who we are. It in part creates who we are, but it doesn't. The past has shaped us, but it does not have to define us. So, for example, I've made mistakes in my life. I've encountered difficulties in my life that I wished in some ways that I hadn't encountered, but when I got done with that first trip and was kind of thinking through what had happened to me and began to see myself in a new light, I realized that I had been looking at myself from the wrong perspective. So I had been thinking about my failures and all the mistakes I had made, but God had been thinking about what I had learned from making those mistakes. And I had been filled really with a sense of shame over my failures, but he was looking at me as a daughter that he loved. And I was feeling this sense of despair and hopelessness, but he knew that he had a plan for me. So I began to think of myself as someone who has learned a lot, who has value, and who has a future. And so, even though, yes, I have made those mistakes and I have experienced those failures, I now better understand that doesn't need to define my future. That is up to me to decide, hey, what do I want to do with my life from today moving forward? And that was, I would say, the first kind of pivotal point in my ability to learn to have more adventure, to live life more fully, and to be able to face fearful situations more from a position of strength and power versus powerlessness.
You have traveled to some breathtaking locations. How do you choose your destinations? What draws you to certain places?
Well, this is kind of the fun thing. It might be, for instance, if you're a cook, you might think, what do I feel like tonight? Cheesecake, pie, brownies, whatever. I start thinking about if it's in the US, what I do is I try to get an overall goal, like what continent. And then when I decide on the continent, I try to learn as much as I can. I mean, not necessarily like an encyclopedic knowledge, but get a good idea of what is unique to that country. Like, what is it known for? What's particularly beautiful? I really love good food, so are there good restaurants, that kind of thing. And I'm a very visual person. I'm a math teacher. I'm really, visual in the way I process information. So, what I do, it's kind of funny how I've grown. When I first started writing, I had a map of Oregon and I would highlight, I want to go on this road or this city or try this restaurant on the coast or whatever. And then it became a map of the United States. It's like, okay, I want to go to this state and that state. And then it became, okay, here's a map of Europe. And now I have a map of the world, because it's more where in the world do I want to go? So, for instance, on this summer's trip to Australia, I have a map of Australia and I'm reading tour books. I'm also checking in with different Facebook groups to find out what are some of the most spectacular, or interesting parts of Australia. I tend to highlight them on my map, and then kind of a path kind of emerges. Like I highlight things I'd like to do in either pink or yellow or whatever, and I just kind of think, okay, where is a route that would take me kind of in general through those places? But I don't tend to pick. Some people figure out I'm going to wake up at 8 a.m. on Thursday, the 25th, and drive 157 miles to this city and stay at this hotel. But I'm more, a lot of motorcyclists, myself included, we like to kind of just allow ourselves to experience the day as it comes. So I might be in a city and run into a couple at another table, and they might tell me, the best pie place you've ever been to in the country is 4 hours in this other direction, maybe the opposite direction I thought I was going the next day. But I might think, well, let's just go there. And so it's a combination of having, I would say, like an overall goal for where to go and knowing what some of the highlights are to pick kind of a general path, and then being open and willing to try new experiences as they present themselves during the trip.
We have a question in the chat. Have your children been supportive of your trips?
They have been, I'm so blessed. My children, talking about mistakes, I'm so grateful that all of them have forgiven me and loved me and all that. But my second husband had a lot of concerns, and he was physically and emotionally and verbally abusive to me. My children, I think I was too afraid to ask him to leave. But my children came to me when the Christmas I was dying of cancer, and they all said to me, Mom, if you survive this and we have children, we will not allow them in the house while this individual is here because he is not a safe person for anybody to be around. And, you know, thinking back on that time, I realized how horrible it was that I did make that mistake of bringing that person into my life, and that I was so weak at the time that I didn't even have enough courage to ask that person to leave. But you mentioned earlier as a mom how we can be motivated by the love for our children. I think when all three kids came to me and essentially said the same thing in their own words, I realized, if I'm going to die of this thing, do I want my last months on earth for my children to be thinking of me as the mom that was too afraid to ask her abusive husband to leave? And so, that gave me the courage to get out of that very dangerous situation and to start forging a new path for me. But I would just have to say that I'm so grateful. you know some of the kids were able to forgive me sooner than the other, but we're now to the point where everything is good. And so I think they know what I've been through. They know that I used to be the mom that would cry on the bathroom floor with, a towel over my face so they wouldn't hear, that was just afraid of riding up my own driveway. And I think they're just so proud, that I've been able to face those fears and to become this adventurer and to hopefully, be an inspiration to others. Um, I think that the thing that they respect and that is also somewhat, I'd say, maybe motivating or inspiring to some people, is, I don't know if you guys can tell by looking at me, but I'm like 5 foot 1 inches tall, like 110 pounds. And so for me to ride, a big motorcycle and to go on these big adventures after not even being able to, go up my driveway is really a testament to how we can accomplish almost anything if we set a goal and then start taking steps, in that direction, and have that confidence in our own strength and courage.
Going back to when you were talking about how you choose a destination, you were also mentioning how you'll go on Facebook and find a group. You find various communities. I think that is very instructive for all travelers
Yeah.
to consider that aspect, to consider community.
Yeah,
Think that's a
and
really
the
great
thing
idea.
that's really cool about it is they have, for example, dozens of motorcycle travel groups. So I usually go to, for example, I'm in 2 or 3 different communities with Australian motorcyclists, and one of my big strategies when I go to a country is to find somebody who rides a motorcycle who lives there. And when I do the post, saying, "Hey, I'm thinking of traveling to Africa, who else has been there and what is your advice?" What usually happens is that there'll be one or two people that I just see are extraordinarily helpful. Like they'll be saying, like, "Well, you have to go to this city and this restaurant, or this road is amazing because of such and such." And so when I identify those one or two individuals, then I follow up with them on Facebook Messenger and I say, "Hey, I really appreciate the information you gave me. Would you be willing to chat by phone, Facebook Messenger, and share more?" For example, last summer when I went to Morocco, this guy, I didn't even have to ask him. He just said in the text, on Facebook, "If you'd like to, know more, feel free to message me." And I call this guy. I didn't know what to think of him. It's like I'd never met this person. He wasn't one of my friends on Facebook, but I thought, well, his name's Red. So I thought, I'll just give him a call. What can it hurt? He doesn't even know my number, right? He was this gregarious, positive, outgoing guy. He nicknamed me Kate. I've never been called Kate in my life. He just called me Kate from that day forward, and essentially told me exactly where I should go in Morocco. And I realized in talking with him that he and I like the same things. We both like good food. We both liked interesting roads. And every time he said something, I'm like, "Wow, that sounds amazing. That sounds fantastic." And then when I got there, it was so funny because he insisted, he called me like every night. "How is it going? How are you doing? What did you do? Where should you go?" And one of my favorite stories to tell about that is that when I was in, where was it? Marrakesh. He had told me, "Go to Jama Square and be careful of the snake vendors because they're going to overcharge you, and eat at this restaurant on the second floor at this time so you can see the lights come on." And I followed all his instructions, and I'm leaving Jama Square like at 10 o'clock at night. And he calls me, "How did it go?" And I'm like, "It was great." And he's like, "You know what you need?" And I said, "What?" He goes, "You need a hammam." And I'm like, "A what?" He's like, "You need a hammam." And I'm like, "Okay, tell me." And he's like, "Okay, you go to this bathhouse and they scrub you from head to toe, and then they rinse you in cold and hot water, and then they massage you." And so he arranged with a taxi cab driver who didn't speak a word of English, to take me to this bathhouse in the middle of the night, essentially, and even coordinated with a guy to drive me back to my hotel. And you know, when I speak about this whole like life transformation I've had publicly, I like to tell people that there are 4 different responses to a fearful situation that are productive. One of them is being willing to accept help from others. And that example with Red, I think, is a beautiful one because, it was rather daunting to go to Africa by myself. And It was a place that was very foreign to me. I didn't speak the language. I had never been there before. The culture is very different than here in the US. But having kind of him as my guide, it was just such a blessing and so wonderful. So, being willing to accept help can be, a very productive thing to do.
We have one question.
Yeah.
Incredible adventure. I wonder if she's gotten stuck in an area with limited services, and if so, how did she handle it?
Well, that's a great question. I have been in many areas with limited services. Fortunately, I've never been like in a life-threatening situation in an area with limited services. The closest I came to that was on the Dalton Highway. And I don't know if people know this, but it is really expensive to buy a sat phone. Even after you buy it, to have the right to use it is thousands of dollars a year. And so I was very fortunate that on that trip up the Dalton, my mom gave me the funds to rent a sat phone for that portion of my trip, because that truly could have been a life or death situation, and it almost was, as I mentioned earlier. But it is actually rather surprising how well our phones do work in most parts of the world. So even when I was in Asia last year and in Africa last year, the vast majority of the time, my phone was able to function. I've also learned how to adapt. To mitigate problems like that. So, for example, if I need to navigate somewhere, which generally you need to do when you're riding on a motorcycle, I do put my destination in on the hotel Wi Fi in the morning when I leave. And then the way the navigation system works is that it keeps it in your phone. Even if you lose the internet, it has still memorized your route and can still somehow tell you how to go. So even though I might be traveling through areas without internet service during my ride, as long as I've set that in my navigation at the beginning of my trip, then I know that I will most likely be able to get there. But even say in Africa, you had to take extra precautions because it was so hot. So when I was in Africa last summer, I had two phones with me because several times my first phone gave me a message. My favorite one was, navigation will be shutting down right now because the phone is overheating. It's like, okay, you're telling me it's too hot to survive out here, and you're also telling me that you're going to quit telling me how to get out of this place. So I just turned off that phone, turned on my other one that I had been kept in a shaded spot of my bike, and was able to use that to continue getting to my hotel and then charge both phones. So I also have things like I have a jack with me. So, like I mentioned, I'm a very petite person, but I have a jack with me that would allow me to jack my bike up if it fell down and I was unable to lift it myself. They do have these amazing videos of these very small women on the internet lifting their humongous bikes. I have to say, I've watched those videos. I admire those women. I have tried following all of their steps, and I have not been able to duplicate what they do. But, you know, again, there's always a way if you try hard enough. Having that jack with me is my solution to that problem. So, knock on wood, I've never found myself in a life or death situation where I didn't have the ability to get the help I needed. Yeah.
Another question from the audience, and we could probably go into your books after that, because it seems to be a good segue. How do you move through the fear? What are some of the practical tips you have for people who want to try new things but have the fear monster stop them?
Okay, that is an excellent question. I love the way the individual said move through fear. Okay, so, and this is something I've really been wanting to address, so I do appreciate that question for that reason as well. I'll have to be honest with you, that is not easily done. I wish I could say, well, just repeat this mantra to yourself and everything will work out. But for me, what that meant is I needed to challenge myself and change my own perception of myself. And for me, it was my experience on the Dalton Highway that has been pivotal that way. And I'll try to give you the short version of it. But essentially, I told you I found that nail in my tire, and I had 500 miles to make it south over a 2-day period to get back to safety, essentially. And because the road had turned to mud and my tires on my bike were not designed for mud, my bike was fishtailing, the handlebars was shaking. It was horrific. My heart was beating so fast I could hardly breathe. There were semis behind me. Their headlights were like looming in my mirrors. And I encountered this section of road construction where there were trucks backing up, pulling forward, stopping, dumping off materials, and they were creating these huge ruts in the road that were going sideways, not not the way I wanted to go. And I literally got to the point where I just didn't feel like I could go on any further. Like I couldn't breathe. I was emotionally overwhelmed. I was terrified. I had no strength left in me. And there's no shoulders on a road like this. There's no like rest stop. I mean, there's nothing, right? It's just the road with semis and that's it. And so I literally lifted my hands up off the handlebars and I just screamed out, I can't do this anymore. And what happened in that moment was part of what has given me courage since then in my life. Two things that happened after that. One was I felt my bike being lifted up and put back on the road in front of me. My hands were completely off the handlebars, and I felt my heart rate slow down, and I felt a sense of peace come over me. And, I was able to make it through that construction zone through a really horrific, mountain with avalanche warnings to the camp that I was going to be staying in that night. And what happened is I arrived at this camp. Okay. I was covered with mud. My bike was covered with mud. I had just gone through the most terrifying thing in my entire life. And I pulled up to this gas pump and got off the bike and could barely stand up. And I had met these three motorcyclists at dinner the night before at this working camp. And they saw me. And one of them yelled out, Kathleen, you made it. And it was weird because it was just this guy the night before. But he ran towards me because they had been worried about me leaving late and being there. He ran towards me with his arms open and he swooped me up and he swirled me around. And I had my helmet on and I'm like laughing and crying at the same time. And he put me down on the ground and he said to me, Kathleen, you are the bravest woman I've ever met. And you know how guys are. The guys are all slapping me on the back. Yes, Kathleen, you're so brave. You're so brave. And that was a transformational moment for me because in that moment, I thought to myself, I am Kathleen the brave. It was like I had gone from being this woman too afraid to leave her abusive husband or drive up her driveway to feeling like I'm actually a brave person. And so when you say move through the fear, I still encounter fearful circumstances. For example, about a little less than 2 years ago, I got diagnosed with four brain tumors. And, that's a terrifying piece of news to encounter. But when I found out about that news, two things came to my head. First of all, if God can lift me up out of a muddy rut on the Dalton, he can help me through this. And the second was I knew how to respond to fear now because I identified as a brave person and I knew that instead of getting fixated on what this might mean about my lifespan or my health, the most appropriate thing I could do was ask myself, what is the next step? So, the way I move through fear is taking that action step. And then also just trusting that I am brave, I am strong, and God is with me.
And I think also there was a practical aspect to it where you say, what do I need? Like literally, I need a cell phone. I need someone to call every day. I need a map. And it's kind of like you listed the things that you
Thank
need
you.
that will.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up because I do want to kind of recap that. That's super important. So, the first productive response to fear is to ask yourself about the action step. Another possible response is to get help. Another can be to embrace the difficulty, like with my brain tumors. It turns out we can't operate or biopsy them, we just have to monitor them. I have decided that rather than live my life in fear of these brain tumors every day, I'm going to focus on the fact that they are a gift to me to remind me to live life to the fullest. So sometimes embracing a fear can be productive. There is one other response I want to briefly touch on, and that is the idea of pivoting. I don't want people to think that I'm saying that no matter how bad a situation is, we should always try it. I'm a firm believer that there are some things we are not meant to do. So, for example, this last summer when I was in Africa, I went through some extraordinarily hot days and my body began to shut down. I was beginning to experience heat stroke, which could have been fatal. I was, stopping every hour, drinking 2 liters of water, trying to rest as much as I could, but I could not stay cool. My body had lost the ability to stay cool. And I had to do what I call a pivot at that point. I literally had to change directions, and so, I sat down at a gas station, got out my map, and figured out, okay, how could I plot a different course so that I could give myself a chance to recover from what could be a very dangerous situation? And I ended up going to the coast in Africa and enjoying 2 delightful days on the beach with a cooler air, getting a massage in my room, reading a good book. And so, moving through fear can look like, moving forward with our action steps, but it can also be getting help from others, embracing the fear, or pivoting and doing something else. Those are the four, in my opinion, productive responses to a fearful situation.
And since you've been traveling to so many places, does motorcycle travel mean being immersed in different cultures? And have you learned from the people you've met along the way?
Yes, you know what's really cool about being on a motorcycle, especially I think if you're a woman, is that people see this teeny woman on a motorcycle and it's just like a conversation starter in itself. Usually the first question is like, where's your team? Like, are you really traveling alone? And I'm like, yes, and then it's like, where have you been and where are you going? And I think if I was driving a car and I, left the restaurant, hopped in my car and closed the door behind me, someone might not come up to my car, door and knock on my window and ask me where I was going next. But if I'm leaving a restaurant and I'm walking out to my motorcycle and I have my helmet and my gloves and I'm kind of adjusting my packs, people always come by and say, those questions. So, in addition to like experiencing the world with all five of your senses, I've really found, even from the first few days of that first summer trip where I was so afraid of being alone, that when you're traveling on a motorcycle, you're never really alone because people just naturally are interested in what you're doing and talkative. And I really enjoy getting to know people in different cultures. And I would say, one of the ways I've grown as a human being is I've learned not to rush those encounters. So let's say I had a thought that I want to arrive in a certain town at a certain time, unless like there's a hotel that won't let me spend the night, and I've already prepaid and I need to check in by a certain time. Like there's some extenuating circumstance, but normally I ask myself, why don't I stop and get to know this person a little bit? Ask them where they've been and where they're going, and engage in a real conversation with them. So that I think is also makes the trips that much more rewarding.
And you've written books about your experience. What
Yes, yeah.
inspired you to put your stories in written form? And is there a core message you're trying to convey?
Thank you for asking that. Just like I never saw myself as a motorcyclist, let alone a worldwide motorcyclist, I certainly didn't think of myself as an author. But, people, as they knew that I was battling cancer and going through a divorce and going on this trip by myself, I had so many people say to me, you really should write a book about this personal transformation that you're experiencing. So, halfway through my first summer trip, I Googled, motorcycle publishers or adventure publishers and came up with one and emailed him. And he said, feel free to send me a manuscript in the fall. And so I made it my birthday present to myself. My birthday is November 18. So November 18, after my first trip, my present to myself was to have the draft for this book done, two-wheeled wind therapy. And that book chronicles like how I learned positive lessons on the road, and how it helped me to see myself more as a person of value. I am so I feel so blessed by the positive feedback I've gotten on that book. And then the second book here, let me pull it out, is this one right here, Living at Full Throttle. This is a totally different book on a different motorcycle, but this basically talks about how I learned to live with my diagnosis of the four brain tumors. And it it pulls on the lessons I learned about strength and bravery in Alaska on that. I had so many people wanting to know, tell us about your riding in Alaska. For whether you're on a motorcycle or not, the Dalton Highway is just infamous around the world. And so it incorporates stories from, the harrowing travels in Alaska, and just recounts how I learned to live life fully despite my diagnosis.
Wow. Well, looking back on your adventures, what advice would you give to someone who has a dream on how to pursue that dream?
Well, again, it comes back to asking yourself, what would you do if fear were not your first thought? So I think identifying the dream, it's kind of funny because I think sometimes we can sell ourselves short by just not even being willing to consider what we could really do with our lives if we kind of, unleashed our inner strength. So I think being willing to have a dream in the first place. It's so easy to get caught up and I have a doctor's appointment today and I'm going to meet someone for lunch but think about what do I really want to do with my life? Like what does living fully look like for me? For me it's a combination of showing others that I love them, spending time with friends and family and going on these epic adventures. Those are all really important to me. Um, and so I think having enough sense of value in ourselves to give ourselves permission to have that dream, and then identifying, as I mentioned, what are some specific action steps that can take to make that happen. For example, you mentioned the sat phone and the bear spray or whatever, but like my dream of going to Africa, everybody told me I was crazy to do this because as a school teacher I can only go there in the summer. I wish I could change the school calendar, but I can't. Well, obviously, in the summer, Africa is at its hottest. And so,
Hmm.
like, it was 110 degrees, and I'm on the motorcycle, right? And those of you that haven't ridden on a motorcycle before might not realize, but it doesn't come with air conditioning. In fact, the interesting thing is when it's that hot, the air actually makes you hotter. And so it's dangerous and difficult. And a lot of people said it couldn't be done. But I started thinking about, okay, what could I do? So being willing to break it down. For me with Africa, it looked like leaving earlier in the day, traveling shorter distances, bringing lots of extra water, changing all of my clothing layers to be 100% merino wool so the sweat would breathe easier, and just taking as many rests as I needed to. So I think we can take almost any challenge and break it down into a series of manageable steps.
One of the audience members wrote a question, what is your medical status right now?
So yeah, the interesting thing about my tumors is I can tell you I don't know. So that being kind of a person that is prone to anxiety and having been through a lot of difficulties in my life, the way someone said it to me once is, Kathleen, you like certainty. Like I run my classroom like a very tight ship. There are specific rules, we all follow them. I like certainty, I like order. I'm actually a very popular teacher in my high school because the kids know they're going to be productive and respectful and learn, and they're going to have a good time. But and so for me to have uncertainty is not ideal. But the situation is with my brain tumors, we can't know whether they're cancerous or not because we can't biopsy them. So all we can do is monitor them. And based on the fact that they have not been growing that quickly, my neurosurgeon believes that they are most likely not cancerous. But we can't know that for sure. And we can't, he also believes that it is most likely that it won't end up affecting my lifespan. But I don't know. I don't know, but here's what I do in my head. Like, believe it or not, sometimes I forget they're there. And then it'll occur to me, oh, right, I have these tumors. So I've trained myself in that moment to say, what a precious gift. Because, I think we're all probably aware of this, but none of us know whether we're going to be here tomorrow or not. We could get run over by a bus when we walk out our front door. We could have a heart attack tonight. Anything could happen to anyone at any time. But how many of us have four brain tumors, to remind us every day of the importance of living life to the fullest? So it's helped me, for example, when I interact with someone to really focus on thinking of them as a human being. How can I show them grace right now? How can I show them love right now? Because I want to be remembered for being a loving person. So anyway, I don't know what my diagnosis is, but I do know that I see my tumors as a gift and that they help me to live life more fully.
Finally, what does living at full throttle truly mean to you?
So I love this expression. So those of you that don't ride a motorcycle full throttle, of course, this is a little bit might kind of shock you. I'm this little conservative person, but I love going fast on a motorcycle. Full throttle means when you pull the throttle on your motorcycle and really gun it. It just means riding fast. So living full throttle to me means living to the maximum extent possible. So like enjoying every moment and thinking about those core values. For me, it's about love and kindness. So I write, for example, in this book, how I made some sacrifices to be able to spend time with my elderly grandmother and interacting with students. And, for me, for example, as a teacher, I don't think of my number one goal as a teacher to teach the kids math. My number one goal as a teacher is to show them the love of Jesus. So I want my kids to know, my children and my students, that I love them more than anything. So I think living to full throttle, if I had to sum it up, means enjoying the moment, being open to adventure, and prioritizing being kindness to others in all circumstances. Thank you. It's been an honor. I appreciate it. Have a good day, everybody.
Okay. Great day,
Bye.
everyone. Bye bye.